Good afternoon, Doctor. I am Brian Lopez Victoria, and today I will present the scholarly review paper that I accomplished. So, the proposed topic is Silent Struggles, Challenges, Coping Mechanisms, and Strategies of Private Elementary Teachers Handling Students with Undiagnosed Learning Disabilities. Inclusive education has become one of the most significant education reform worldwide as countries continue to promote equitable access to quality education for all learners regardless of disability, socioeconomic status, language, culture, or other individual differences. That's according to the United Nations Educational, Scientific, and Cultural Organization. Furthermore, the United Nations recognized the inclusive and equitable quality education as a global development priority through Sustainable Development Goal or the SDG 4, which call upon governments and education institutions to provide quality education and lifelong learning opportunities for all learners without discrimination. In the Philippines, inclusive education has become an essential component of educational reform through the enactment of Republic Act number 11650, otherwise known as the Inclusive Education for Learners with Disability Act. Complementing this legislative initiative, the Department of Education or the DepEd issue a DepEd Order number 44 Series 2021 which provide policy guidelines for implementing educational program and services for learners with disability within the K-12 basic educational program. So, despite this significant policy developments, the successful implementation of inclusive education remain largely dependent on teachers who serve as the primary facilitator of the inclusive classroom practices. According to UNESCO, emphasized that teachers play a central role in identifying learners' need, adapting instruction, and creative learning environment that is promote participation and academic success for all students. Likewise, DepEd Order number 44 Series 2021 recognizes that teachers are expected to implement differentiated instructions, provide appropriate classroom accommodation, collaborate with parents and multidisciplinary professionals, and deliver timely educational intervention for learners requiring additional support. In this topic, we will proceed to the research gap. So first, the population gap. The review literature predominantly examined public school teacher, SPED teacher, and general education teacher implementing inclusive education in government school. So very limited attention has been given to private elementary school. So that's the reason why there is a population gap because most of the literature are focusing more on school teacher or SPED teachers, and we are lacking or having a limited resources when it comes to the private elementary school teacher. And of course, so the next one is the context gap. Existing local and foreign studies focus mainly on inclusive classroom serving learners with diagnosed learning disability, especially educational needs or student already receiving a formal educational support. So there are a few studies examine that instructional contexts where teachers suspected learning disability but formal diagnosis has not yet been established. So we are always focusing on a specific learning disability for those students who are diagnosed, but we are lacking of information or we are having a limited information or literatures when it comes to the undiagnosed students. Now let's proceed to the next research gap, which is the methodological gap. So most review study utilize quantitative, descriptive correlation or general qualitative approaches to examine teachers' challenges, stress, and inclusive practices. So although some studies adopted penological methods, they focus primarily on SPED teachers or teachers working with learning who had already been diagnosed. So next gap, which is the variable gap. Previous study typically investigated teachers' challenges, stress level, coping mechanism, or instructional strategies as separate constructs. So, few studies comprehensively examine the interactions among the challenges, coping mechanism, and the instructional strategy within a single investigation involving teachers handling undiagnosed learning disabilities. So, most of the literatures are focusing on one problem, which is the challenges, only the stress level, or only the coping mechanism. But in this study, we're going to incorporate all this in one single investigation. Now let's proceed to the next slide. In response to these identified gaps, this scholarly review paper synthesized local and foreign literature concerning teachers' challenges, coping mechanism, and instructional strategies in implementing inclusive education, particularly when supporting learners with suspected or undiagnosed learning disability. So specifically, the reviews integrate empirical findings, examining dominant theoretical perspective, identify consistent patterns and existing limitation, and establish the research gap that justify the proposed study entitled Silent Struggles, Challenges, Coping Mechanism, and Strategies of Private Elementary Teachers Handling Students with Undiagnosed Learning Disabilities. So more importantly, the synthesis of evidence provide the scholarly foundations for development of a professional training program that will strengthen teachers' knowledge, instructional competence, and the confidence in identifying the responding to learner who exhibit characteristic or undiagnosed learning disability. So now let's proceed to the study objective. The general objective of this study is to explore the lived experiences of private elementary teachers in handling students with undiagnosed learning disability by examining the challenges they encounter, the coping mechanism they employ, and the teaching strategies they implement as the basis for developing a professional training program. So let's proceed to the specific learning objectives, which is to explore the challenges experienced by the private elementary teachers in handling students with undiagnosed learning disability. Number two, to generate a deeper understanding of coping mechanism employed by the private elementary teachers in managing the challenges associated with teaching students with undiagnosed learning disability. And of course, the third one is to examine the teaching strategies implemented by the private elementary teachers who address the learning needs of students with undiagnosed learning disability. So now let's proceed to the review of methodology. This scholarly review employ a thematic narrative review to synthesize existing literature related to the challenges, coping mechanism, and teaching strategy of teachers handling learnings with learning disability, with particularly emphasis on students with undiagnosed learning disability. So a thematic narrative review was considered the most appropriate approach because the purpose of the paper was not to statistically combine findings from previous studies, but to critically synthesize, compare, and interpret existing evidence to establish the current state of knowledge, identify research gap, and justify the proposed study. Furthermore, this approach allowed the integration of finding from study with diverse research design, educational context, and theoretical perspective, thereby providing comprehensive understanding of the phenomenon under the investigation. So now let's proceed to the inclusion criteria. The selection of literature followed by explicit inclusion criteria established during the development of the annotated bibliography and literature matrix. So study were included if they were published in peer-reviewed journal, conference proceeding, or reputable academic application. Number two, were published primarily between 2020 and to 2026, although seminal theoretical works were retained were necessary to establish the conceptual framework of the study. And of course, the third one is focus on inclusive education, learning disabilities, special education need, teacher challenges, coping mechanism, instructional strategy, teachers preparedness, or related educational practices. So now let's proceed to the another inclusion criteria, which is to examine variables related to the proposed study, particularly teachers' challenges as the dependent variable and coping mechanism as the dependent variables, together with the instruction strategies and inclusive teaching practices. And last but not the least, were written in English and provide sufficient methodological and empirical evidence to support the scholarly synthesis. Now let's proceed to the exclusion. So um the exclusion is the study were excluded if they were published outside the as established publication period without providing a significant theoretical contribution, were not peer review, focused primarily on medical and clinical intervention, are related to classroom teaching, lack methodological rigor, contain insufficient empirical findings, or address an educational context that were not relevant to inclusive elementary education, and duplicate publication, opinion articles, editorial, and study with limited relevance to the identified research variable were likewise excluded to maintain the quality, credibility, and the relevance of the review literature. Furthermore, the literature search was guided by keywords derived from the trend analysis reflection and subsequently refined during the construction of the literature matrix. The primary search term included inclusive education, teachers' challenges, coping mechanism, instructional strategy, learning disability, undiagnosed learning disability, special educational needs, private elementary teachers, teachers' preparedness, and the teachers' resilience, and the inclusive classroom practices. So literature was retrieved from reputable academic databases and scholarly repositories, including ERIC, ResearchGate, Springer Link, Sage, Journal, Taylor and Francis Online, Google Scholar, what more? E-journals, Philippines, and other peer-reviewed journal database to ensure comprehensively cover of both the local and the foreign literature. Now let's proceed to the thematic literature synthesis. One of the most frequently identified challenges, of course, we will go into proceed to thematic literature. Is the first one is theme one: teachers' challenges in handling student with learning disability. So one of the most frequently identified challenges is the lack of specialized knowledge and professional training in inclusive education. Previous study consistently reported that teachers often feel inadequate prepared to recognize learning difficulties, implementing appropriate intervention and adapt instructions to accommodate diverse learners. That's according to Alcatib et al., Kahil Parada, Equation Espiritu. And likewise, Psycho also emphasized that insufficient professional development limit teachers' confidence and competence in supporting learners with special needs or educational needs. These findings suggest that teachers' preparedness remain a critical factors influencing the effectiveness of the inclusive educational practices. The theme two is which is the teaching strategy in supporting students with undiagnosed learning disability. So teaching strategies are fundamental to the successful implementation of inclusive education because they enable teachers to respond effectively to the diverse learning needs of the student within the mainstream classroom. So, inclusive educational practices require teachers to adopt flexible, learning centered, and evidence based instructional approaches that promote equitable participation and a meaningful learner for all students, including those with learning disability. Rather than relying on a single method of instruction, teachers are expected to modify classroom practices according to learners' strength, needs, interest, and the learning profile to ensure that every student has an access to quality education. That's according to Tomlinson 2001. So now let's proceed to next theme, which is the theme three: relationship between teacher challenges and teaching strategies. So the review literature consistently demonstrate that teacher challenges significantly influence the teaching strategies they employ in inclusive education or in the classroom. So as instructional demands become more complex, teachers are required to continuously modify their pedagogical approaches to accommodate learners with diverse educational needs, particularly those within learning disability. That's according to Tolimson 2001, UNESCO 2020. Across both local and foreign studies, a common finding is that inadequate professional preparation, limited instructional resources, increasing workload, and insufficient institutional support directly affect teachers' ability to implement evidence based instruction practices effectively. And also, this findings suggest that instructional decisions are often shaped by the professional challenges teacher encountered rather than by pedagogical knowledge alone. Now let's proceed to the theme 4, which is the contextual and population-based perspective in inclusive education. So the review literature demonstrate that teachers' experience in implementing inclusive education vary considerably across educational setting. So institution and learners population, these contextual differences influence the nature of um, the challenges teachers encounter, the teaching strategies they employ, the support system available to them. So although the literature consistently support the principle of inclusive education, the finding indicate that educational context remains a significant factor of affecting its implementations, that according to the UNESCO and Department of Education. So lastly, the theme 5, which is the methodological trend in review literature. So the review literature demonstrate a consistent preference of qualitative and descriptive research design in examining teacher experiences within inclusive educational settings. So qualitative approaches, particular penological and case study design, were widely employed to explore teachers' lived experience, perception, and professional practices, providing rich descriptions of the challenges they encounter and the strategy they adopt in a supporting learning in supporting learning with special educational needs. So, in contrast with it, descriptive correlation study were used to examine relationship among teachers' challenges, coping strategies, and support needs. So, allowing researchers to identify significant pattern across large teacher population. That's according to Punzalan et al. So, these methodological approaches collectively provide a comprehensive understanding of inclusive education by combining in-depth personal experience with a measurable educational trends. Now let's proceed to the next slide, which is the critical analysis of literature, a dominant theoretical framework. So the review literature demonstrate that inclusive education is a primary grounded in educational and psychological theories that explain how teachers respond to learners' diversity within a mainstream classroom. Among the dominant framework identified is differentiated instruction theory by Tomlinson 2001, the Universal Design for Learning or the UDL framework by Cass 2008, and the Stress and Coping Theory by Lazarus and Folkman 1984, and the Principle of Inclusive Education advocate by the UNESCO 2020, were the most frequently reflected in the literature. So this framework collectively emphasized the effective inclusive education require flexible instructional practices, equitable access to learning, and teachers who are capable of adapting instruction according to student diverse educational needs. Although these theories complement one another, they address different dimensions of inclusive education. Differentiated instruction theory primarily explain how teachers modify curriculum, instructions, assessment according to learners' readiness and interest, and learning profile. So whereas the UDL framework emphasized designing learning environment that proactively reduce barriers to participation through multiple means of engagement, representation, and expression. And in contrast, stress and coping theory explain how teachers respond psychologically to increase occupational demands and professional challenges. And of course, study guided by instructional theories generally focus on classroom practices and teaching effectiveness, while those influenced by psychological framework emphasize teacher resilience, professional adaptation, and workplace experiences. Now let's proceed to another, which is the methodological pattern. So some of the review study exhibit consistent methodological pattern that reflect current research practices in inclusive education. So qualitative, methodological, particularly phenomenological, and case study approaches were commonly employed to explore teachers' lived experiences, perceptions, and instructional practices because this design provide detailed description of complex classroom realities. That's according to Lucena 2026, Mina 2020, and 2024. So qualitative, descriptive, and descriptive correlation design were likewise prevalent, particularly in the study examining teachers' challenges, support needs, and instructional practices across larger participants. That's according to Punzalan et al., Quizana and Espiritu, so 2023. So collectively, these methodological approaches contributed valuable evidence by combining contextual understanding with measurable educational trends. So purposive sampling also emerged as the dominant sampling strategies because enabled researchers to recruit participants with direct experience in inclusive education. Survey questionnaires, semi-structured interviews, focus group discussion, classroom observation, and document analysis were most frequently utilized data collections method, with several study employing methodological triangulation of to enhance the credibility of findings. So these approaches strengthen the authenticity of the reported experiences while allowing researchers to examine inclusive education from multiple perspectives. However, the evaluation of the review literature also revealed that recurring methodological limitation. Many studies were conducted within a single school or limited geographical location, reducing the generability of their findings. So, in addition with this, most investigation focus on public school and teachers working with learners who had already received formal diagnosis or disability or special educational needs. So, ibig sabihin, diagnosed na po sila. So, resulting in a limited representation of private educational institution and learners with undiagnosed learning disability. Now let's proceed to the conceptual issue. So the comparative analysis of the literature identified several conceptual concerns that may affect the consistency and the interpretations of research finding. One recurring issue involved the inconsistent use of terminology describing learners with learning disabilities, especially educational needs, inclusive education, and undiagnosed learning difficulties. So some study use this concept interchangeably without clearly distinguish between formal diagnosis and disability and the suspected learning difficulties identified through classroom observation. That's according to Sowell 2020, Cahill, and Pradia 2023. Such inconsistency complicate comparison across studies and may influence how teachers' experience are interpreted. So similarly, considerably variation exists in the operationalization of teachers' challenges and teaching strategy. While some studies conceptualize teachers' challenges primarily as instructional difficulties, others included administrative responsibility, emotional stress, institutional support, and resources limitation within the same construct. So likewise, teaching strategy were described using the wide range of instructional practices, including differentiated instruction, classroom accommodations, learning centered approaches, and inclusive pedagogy, often without consistent operation definition. So, this overlap makes it more difficult to determine which instructional approaches are more effective under specific classroom condition. So now let's proceed to the theoretical implication. So the synthesis of the review literature demonstrate that inclusive education continues to involve or evolve as a multidisciplinary field requiring a stronger theoretical integration, rigorous research methodologies, practical educational interventions, and responsive institutional policies, so that the limitation identified throughout the annotated bibliography, literature matrix, trend analysis reflection, and the research gap analysis indicate several opportunities for future investigations that can strengthen both the scholarly understanding and the practical implementation of inclusive education, particularly for learners with undiagnosed learning disability. So the review literatures confirm that continuing relevance of differentiated instruction theory, that's according to Tomlinson 2001, the Universal Design for Learning or the UDL framework, that's CAS 2018, is stress and coping theory, Lazarus and Folkman 1980. And the principle of inclusive education promoted by UNESCO 2020. Collectively, these frameworks explain how teachers adapt instructions, manage professional demands, and create equitable learning environment for diverse learners. However, the review also revealed that these theories have generally been applied independently without limited attempts to explain the interconnected relationship between teachers' challenges, teaching strategies, and the professional adaptation. So, future researchers should therefore develop an integrated conceptual models that combine instructional, psychological, and organization perspective to better explain teachers' decision making when supporting students with suspected or undiagnosed learning disabilities. Such theoretical integration would contribute to a more comprehensive understanding of inclusive education or inclusive educational practices and provide a stronger foundation for teachers' professional development. So now let's proceed to the next slide, which is the methodological implication. So the review study indicates that dominant reliance on qualitative, descriptive correlation and research design with purposive sampling and self-reported questionnaires or interviews serving as the primary method of data collections that according to Lucena 2026, Mina 2024, Kizana and Spirit 2023. While these approaches have generally valuable insight into teachers' experience, they provide limited opportunities to examine changes in instructional practices over time or establish a stronger evidence regarding causal relationship. Future researchers should consider employing mixed method design, longitudinal investigation, classroom observation, or methodological triangulation to obtain a more comprehensive understanding of teachers' instructional practices. Furthermore, expanding participant selection to include teachers from differential educational sector, geographical location, and school classification would improve the transferability and applicability of the research findings. So the development and the validation of context specific research instruments focusing on the teachers handling students with undiagnosed learning disability should likewise be prioritized. Now let's proceed to the policy implication. So the trend analysis, reflection, and the review literature consistently highlights the teachers continues to encounter the challenges related to the limited professional preparation and inadequate instructional resources, increased classroom diversity, and uncertainty in identifying the learners with undiagnosed learning disability. That's according to UNESCO 2020 Republic Act number 11650 2022, Cahill and Prada 2023, and Psycho et al. 2025. So these findings suggest that future researchers should move beyond documenting teachers' experiences and focus on designing, implementing, and evaluating evidence based on professional development initiative. In particular, intervention studies should examine the effectiveness of structured professional training programs that strengthen the teacher's competencies in early identification, differentiated instructional classroom accommodations, progress monitoring, and collaboration with parents and multidisciplinary professionals. So evaluating the impact of such program on teachers' instructional competency and learners' outcome would provide a practical evidence for improving the inclusive educational practice, and particularly with the private elementary school or the private sector. Now let's proceed to the next, which is the policy implication. So the review literature further suggests that the successful implementation of inclusive education depends not only on the individual teachers' competence, but also on supportive education policy and institutional commitment. International framework, including the UNESCO Educational 2000 2030 Agenda and Sustainable Development Goal, or the SDG 4, together with the Philippine policies such as the Republic Act number 11650 and the Department of Education Inclusive Educational Policy Framework, established the legal and policy foundation for providing equitable education opportunities to all learners. That's according to UNESCO 2020, Republic Act number 11650 2022, and the Department of Education. Nevertheless, the literature indicate persistent gap between policy intentions and classroom implementation, particularly regarding teachers' preparation and supports for learners with undiagnosed learning disability. Future researchers should therefore examine how educational institution and policymaker can strengthen teachers' preparation program, institutional support system, early screening and referral mechanism, and continuous professional development initiatives. So the evidence generated from such study may guide educational reform and contribute to policies that better support teachers while improving the inclusive education across both public and the private elementary school. So overall, the implications identified through this scholarly review underscore the need for future investigation that integrate theory, employ more rigorous methodology, address practical educational challenges, and inform responsive educational policies. More importantly, future studies should prioritize the development and evaluation of evidence based professional training programs that equip private elementary teachers with the knowledge, instructional skills, and professional competencies necessary to effectively support students with suspected or undiagnosed learning disability. Such effort will contribute has a huge contribution not only to the advancement of inclusive education research, but also to the improvement of classroom practices, in institutional capacity, and educational equity and quality education. Now let's proceed to the next slide, which is the alignment with proposed research study. So the development of the proposed study was guided by the systematic research development process in which each completed output contributed in refining the research problem, identifying the research gap, and establish the significance of the investigation rather than being developed independently. The trend analysis reflection annotated bibliography literature matrix research gap analysis paper, and the reflected journal collectively informed the conceptualization of the study entitled Silent Struggle, Challenges, Coping Mechanism, and Teaching Strategy for Private Elementary Teachers Handling Students with Learning Disability. The integration of this research output ensured that proposed study was grounded in current evidence, theoretical foundation, and identified gaps in existing body of knowledge. So the trend analysis reflection established the relevance and the urgency of the research topic by demonstrating the increasing global and national emphasis on the inclusive education. So the international initiative includes including the UNESCO Educational 2030 Agenda and Sustainable Development Goal number 4, advocate equitable and inclusive quality education for all learners. While Philippines educational reform, particular Republic Act number 11650, the Department of Education's inclusive education policies framework reinforce the government's commitment to strengthen the inclusive education practices. Despite this development, the trend analysis revealed that persistent concern regarding teachers' preparedness, limited professional development, inadequate instructional support, and the continuing challenges encountered when teaching students with learning disability. More importantly, the review of current educational trends highlight the limited attention given to student with undiagnosed learning disability, thereby establishing practical relevance and timeliness of the proposed study. So, in the annotated bibliography, further strengthened the conceptual foundation of the study by critically evaluating local and foreign literature related to the teacher's challenges, teaching strategies, and coping mechanism, and inclusive education. So the systematic evaluation of empirical study confirmed that research variable are consistently recognized as important factors influencing successful inclusive classroom implementation. Furthermore, the annotated review identified the dominant theoretical framework informing previous investigation, including differential instructions theory, the universal design for learning framework, the stress and coping theory, and the principle of inclusive education advocated by the UNESCO. So this theoretical perspective collectively support the conceptual assumptions of the present study by explaining how teachers respond to instructional challenges and adapt teaching strategy and sustain inclusive educational practices. Now let's proceed to the next slide, which is the literature matrix. So in the literature matrix serve as the primary analytical tool for synthesizing finding across the review study. Through systematic comparison of research objective, methodological, theoretical foundation, participants' characteristic, major finding, and identified limitation, the literature major revealed that recurring themes that shape the conceptual structure of the proposed study. So specifically, the synthesis demonstrated that teacher challenges emerge inconsistently as the principal concern experienced by the educators or teachers in inclusive classroom, while teaching strategies were repeatedly identified as the instructional responses employed to address the learners' diversity. So the literature matrix also highlighted coping mechanism as an important supporting factor that influence teachers' professional resilience and instructional effectiveness. So this synthesis provide the basis for organizing the scholarly review into thematic discussion and inform the selection of the study variable and conceptual framework. Now, let's proceed to the alignment with the proposed research study. So, the reflective journal documented the progressive development of the researchers, understanding throughout the research process. So, initial literature exploration revealed broad issues related to inclusive education. However, continuous critical reading, annotation, synthesis, and evaluating gradually refined the research focus towards the experience of private elementary teachers handling student with undiagnosed learning disabilities. So the reflective process also reinforced the importance of clinically evaluating theoretical framework, comparing to methodological approaches, identifying recurring conceptual pattern, and recognizing limitation within existing studies. So as a result, the researchers develop a deeper appreciation of the complexity of inclusive education and recognize the importance of producing a research that addressed practical educational concern while contributing to the scholarly knowledge. So taken together, all of these are this research development output demonstrate a clear and logical progression from identifying current educational trend to evaluating existing literature to synthesizing research evidence, establish research gap, and refining the research focus through critical reflection. So this systematically process provide a strong scholarly foundation for the proposed study and confirm that the investigation is both theoretical grounded and empirical justified. So all the study seeks not only to contribute the existing body of knowledge on inclusive education, but also to generate evidence for the development of an evidence-based professional training program that will enhance the competency of a private elementary teachers in identifying, supporting, and effectively teaching students with undiagnosed learning disability. Now let's proceed to the conclusion. So the scholar review demonstrate that inclusive education has become an increasingly significant priority in both international and Philippine educational system. So reflecting a collective commitment to ensure equitable access to quality education for all learners regardless of their abilities of learning needs. Global initiatives such as the UNESCO Educational or Education 2030 Agenda and Sustainable Development Goal number 4 together with the national policy including the Republic Act number 11650 and the Department of Education Inclusive Education Policy Framework have reinforced the responsibility of school to establish an inclusive learning environment that recognize learners diversity and promote educational equity. However, despite this policy development and institutional commitment, the review literature consistently indicate that teachers continue to experience substantial challenges in translating inclusive education principles into effective classroom practices, particularly when supporting students with learning disability and those who remain undiagnosed. Overall, the comprehensive review of the literature provide a strong scholarly foundation for proposed study entitled Silent Struggles, Challenges, Coping Mechanisms, and Teaching Strategies of Private Elementary Student with Undiagnosed Learning Disability. The systematically integration of the trend analysis, reflection, annotated bibliography, the literature matrix, and the research gap also, and the other research development output demonstrate a logical progression from the identifying current educational issue to establish a clear defined research problem supported by empirical evidence. So sequently, the proposed study is to expected to contribute to the growing body of knowledge on inclusive education by providing a deeper understanding of the experiences of a private elementary student handling student with undiagnosed learning disability. More importantly, the findings are expected also to serve as a foundation for developing an evidence-based professional training program that will strengthen teacher competencies in early in the identification, inclusive instructional planning, effective teaching strategies, and classroom intervention, thereby contributing to the improvement of inclusive educational practices and realization of equitable learning opportunity for all students, regardless of their backgrounds or in their disability. So that's all for my presentation for this morning, ma'am. So thank you so much for listening and for being stayed there up to this part. So thank you so much, ma'am. I hope I explained it clearly with regards with the outcome. Thank you so much, ma'am. God bless you po.